Chapter 1. The Stigma Against Cannabis, Where It Came From, and What It's Cost Us. The vast majority of U.S. adults support the legalization of cannabis, with 60% supporting legalization for medical and recreational use, and 31% supporting medical use only. Only 8% say it should not be legal for use by adults in any scenario. These numbers are promising for those of us in the industry, but behind the numbers, many stigmas still exist. For nearly 100 years, a PR campaign has been waged against cannabis. Though public opinion is now shifting, it will take time to undo the decades of lies and misinformation. To help you understand what we are up against, I want to take you back to 2008. Barack Obama had just won the presidential election, and an initiative for medical marijuana passed in Michigan, with 63% in favor. Individuals were now allowed to grow their own cannabis for medical use, and caregivers were allowed to grow cannabis for up to 5 patients, with a maximum of 72 plants. Now meet Mike. Mike worked as a general contractor in Michigan and was a long-term cannabis user. In many instances, blue-collar laborers do not have access to traditional health care. Given the physical toll of their jobs, many, like Mike, self-medicate with cannabis to ease their aches and pains. With medical marijuana legalized and a recent leg injury that had confined him to his home, Mike began cultivating cannabis. Then, in 2010, he started a clinic where people could come and get the certification that allowed them to possess cannabis. Mike saw the occasional 20-something who wanted an MMJ, medical marijuana card, as a path to recreational use. But mostly he saw people desperate for pain management and treatment for other qualifying conditions under Michigan state law. He saw cancer patients who wanted cannabis to manage their symptoms. He saw individuals in such debilitating pain that they needed wheelchairs to maneuver through the world. He saw uninsured individuals who couldn't afford traditional healthcare procedures or prescription medication and just wanted something to manage their pain. Unfortunately, the laws in Michigan were gray. While medical use had been legalized, there was not a clear path to selling cannabis. The law did not explicitly ban dispensaries, but neither did it create a path to opening one. So even after getting an MMJ card, many patients could not actually get cannabis unless they grew the plants themselves, which was not feasible for everyone, or happened to know a caregiver. Seeing this need for product and accessibility, and unaware of the legal issues, Mike decided to open a dispensary in 2013. 6 months later, in 2014, Michigan State police officers decked out in SWAT-like gear stormed both Mike's house and the dispensary. Mike's staff were handcuffed and forced to sit on the ground for hours as officers searched the property. The police ultimately seized Mike's car as well as everything in his bank account. Everyone was hit with felony charges. After fighting the charges and taking a plea deal, Mike's final conviction was possession of 2 grams, or approximately 3 walnut-sized buds. Fortunately, he didn't go to prison, although if his skin color were different, this would likely be a different story. Still, it was a felony, which makes gaining meaningful employment exponentially more difficult. Though cannabis is now legal both medically and recreationally in Michigan, Mike still has a felony on his record for 2 grams of cannabis. Some states are looking at automatic expungement for cannabis offenses, but under the current laws in Michigan as of 2020, you have to hire a lawyer to get your record expunged, which can cost thousands of dollars. Mike is in the privileged position where he could afford to do that if needed, but many others are not. If you require people to hire a lawyer, or the process is so complicated that it's incredibly difficult without a lawyer, you've created a pay-to-play system that will disproportionately impact people of color, who are more likely to not be able to afford a lawyer due to systemic wealth and income inequalities. Mike's entire life was upended following the raids, and it took him years to pick the pieces back up again. Everything in his head said he was doing the right thing by cultivating and selling cannabis for pain management purposes. After all, medical use was legalized and he was helping people. From the Michigan State Police's perspective, due to the legal gray area, he was doing wrong and they were doing their jobs. However, I have to believe there were more heinous crimes to pursue. The point I'm trying to make here is that despite legalization and majority support of medical cannabis, a huge stigma remained. These raids occurred less than 7 years ago and 6 years after medical marijuana was passed in Michigan. The percentage of the Michigan population that supported medical marijuana in 2008 is approximately the same as the percentage of the U.S. population that supports medical and recreational use today, 60%. There are thousands of individuals with a similar story to Mike's. As such stories show, as great as those numbers seem, they don't mean that we're not still up against challenges as an industry. We are. Despite widespread public acceptance, rules and regulations significantly lag behind, ultimately delaying consumer accessibility. There remain large pockets of this country continuing to use cannabis as a tool to create new criminals. Breaking the stigma against cannabis is the responsibility of each and every individual currently working in the cannabis industry. In particular, for those of us working in retail, we are on the front lines of changing the criminal and negative perceptions associated with cannabis. As frontline workers, it is important to understand how the stigma against cannabis came about, and how it has harmed not just the cannabis industry and cannabis users, but our entire country. We've all been lied to. These big lies have shaped our beliefs about race, cannabis, and addiction, and it's time to unmask these big lies for what they are: lies. Big lie number 1: Black men are dangerous. The lie that black men are inherently dangerous extends far, far back into our country's history, but we're going to start in the 1930s with a man named Harry J. Anslinger. Anslinger became the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. He was so racist that he was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1920s. He frequently used the N-word in official police memos, and he's responsible for targeting and harassing Billie Holiday for singing the song Strange Fruit about lynchings. Anslinger initially spent most of his time chasing down bootleggers. When Prohibition ended in 1933, he suddenly found himself out of a job. For the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to continue to have purpose and receive the funding that paid his salary, Anslinger had to find a new boogeyman to prosecute. He chose marijuana, a term which itself has racist roots and was a way to otherize cannabis as a Mexican drug. At this time, cannabis was not regulated in any way in the United States, so he first had to make it illegal. In order to do that, he needed people to fear it. He figured, why not link it to something people already fear? Black people, particularly black men. And so the propaganda began. Anslinger sparked a national anti-cannabis movement by tying cannabis usage to the black community and other marginalized groups. "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men," Anslinger was quoted as saying. "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." Considering that 14-year-old Emmett Till was brutally killed for allegedly flirting with or whistling at a white woman in 1955, you can imagine how effective this messaging was. Few things scared American people as much as the idea of black men sleeping with white women. Obviously, Anslinger didn't invent racism, but his propaganda propagated and amplified it. He also institutionalized a method to criminalize and persecute black people and other minorities through the war on drugs. He led the Federal Bureau of Narcotics until 1962, And there is no doubt in my mind that during his more than 30-year tenure, his racism cascaded down through the Bureau. He directly and indirectly created much of the institutionalized racism that exists today, manifesting itself in the form of mass incarceration and police brutality. I actually own a small relic of his racist campaign, a reefer madness magnet I picked up many years ago while traveling that depicts a devil that, not so coincidentally, looks like a black man. In short, Anslinger used the lie that black men are dangerous to help make cannabis illegal, and then he weaponized cannabis against minority communities. It's a strategy many politicians, including Richard Nixon, have since used. John Ehrlichman, counsel to Nixon and assistant to the president for domestic affairs, once said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the Vietnam War or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. People of color are disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs to this day. According to an ACLU report, there were more than 6.1 million cannabis arrests between 2010 to 2018. The vast majority of these arrests, 9 out of every 10 to be specific, were for possession. And though black and white people use cannabis at similar rates, a black person is 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for possession. Hispanic and other racial minorities almost certainly face disparities in arrest rates as well, but due to the way certain data is collected and reported, it is more difficult to determine specific statistics for these groups. Black men, and racial minorities as a whole, are not dangerous. As industry professionals, we need to understand the racist roots behind the stigma of cannabis and do our part to elevate those groups disproportionately and unfairly impacted by the war on drugs. Q&A with Betty Mitchell, CEO of Tivoli. Betty Mitchell is a cannabis entrepreneur from California who owns Live Aid Wellness and Tivoli, and she was the first graduate of the Sacramento CORE Cannabis Opportunity Reinvestment and Equity program. She graciously agreed to share her thoughts about cannabis for this book, from the stigma of cannabis to her experience as a black woman in the industry, to advice for minority owners and cannabis retailers in general. Question: what has been your experience with the stigma of cannabis? Answer: growing up in Arkansas, if you talked about cannabis, you might as well have been talking about heroin. At that time, a lot of Vietnam vets were coming home and getting addicted to heroin, which was horrible. And cannabis was put on that same level. Still, today, people put cannabis in the same category as meth or heroin, when it isn't even in the same ballpark. I think some of it is connected to the religious front, as the stigma seems the worst to me in the Southern Bible Belt states. But it's all smoke and mirrors. These are the states where people preach against sex, but then they're the #1 online porn consumers in the United States. If God comes back, they think she'll take out San Francisco or New York first, but I think she's going to take the Southern Bible Belt states. People will slowly come around, though, once they need it themselves. When you're in pain, it's amazing how the mind will shift and reposition cannabis. Question: how did the war on drugs impact your community? Answer: I can remember people getting stopped for whatever reason, and then the cops would find a little joint on them. Just a joint was enough to send you to jail for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. That might not seem long, but it was long enough to lose your job. And once you lost your job, it took you down quicker than anything. If you were married and had 2 kids, it would take the whole family down. And God help you if you had an 8th bag, because that could get you serious jail time, 2 or 3 years. That kind of thing followed you. not only affecting your ability to get a job, but also giving you a stigma in the community. Jail and prison are two very different things, but if you went to jail, people treated it just like you'd gone to prison. It was a double dip. You had the cops and the entire system working against you, and then your own community could be pretty unforgiving, labeling you a drug addict. Big lie number 2. Cannabis is dangerous. Using fear of black men, Anslinger convinced people that cannabis was dangerous. He reinforced and disseminated this lie with the Gore Files, a collection of 200 violent crimes, including armed robbery, assault, and murder, that Anslinger claimed were due to cannabis usage. One of the most famous was the Licata killings in 1933, in which Victor Licata murdered his parents and 3 siblings with an axe. According to Anslinger, he did so under the influence of cannabis. A year prior to the killings, though, police had tried to commit Licata due to mental illness. The Licata murders were undoubtedly tragic, but all facts point to mental illness as the cause, not cannabis. Despite this, Anslinger spun these and other such stories to fit his purpose. The criminals highlighted in these stories were designed to prey on people's fears, with perpetrators including child rapists, as well as Black, Hispanic, lesbian, and other minority groups that were wrongly discriminated against. Anslinger catapulted these stories to a national level with the help of William Randolph Hearst, who owned several yellow journalism, aka fake news, newspapers across the country that focused on sensationalization as opposed to factual reporting. In a hearing that led to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the first regulation of cannabis in the country, Anslinger stood in front of Congress and listed case after case of violent crimes, attributing them to cannabis usage. He even went so far as to say that one cannabis cigarette might develop a homicidal mania, and he claimed that all the experts agree that the continued use leads to insanity. These were blatant lies. In fact, 29 of 30 representatives from the American Medical Association objected to his proposed ban of cannabis. Anslinger, however, routinely rejected any evidence that contradicted his claims, calling it unscientific. Of those 200 cases listed in the Gore Files, guess how many were properly attributed to cannabis usage? 0. That's right. Researchers later found that 198 of the 200 crimes were wrongly attributed to cannabis usage, and the remaining 2 cases were entirely fictional. At the time, though, with no internet or mass communication, it was all too easy for Anslinger to propagate these lies as truth. The idea that cannabis makes people dangerous is ludicrous to me. I grew up during the war on drugs, and I bought into many of the lies. I truly believed cannabis was bad, but never once did I think of cannabis users as dangerous. As a child, I spent time around both alcoholics and cannabis users, and the difference was clear to me. Drunk people were violent, abusive, and dangerous. High people were safe, normal, and, most importantly, not violent. Over the years, as it became blatantly clear that cannabis does not turn people into violent criminals, the stigma shifted. Cannabis was attached to the hippie movement and linked to subversive behavior, like not supporting the Vietnam War or rejecting puritanical views of sex. Anything that went against social norms was considered dangerous, and so cannabis was still branded evil, with cannabis users being labeled as stinky, dirty, lazy stoners, a stigma that, in many ways, continues to this day. In the drug education I received, I learned that all drugs are fundamentally bad, with no differentiation. Cannabis, meth, heroin, LSD, cocaine, they were all grouped together. Maybe you remember the 1980s commercial of a frying egg with the tagline, "This is your brain on drugs," not "This is your brain on crack" or "This is your brain on heroin." These ads were well-intentioned, but when a bunch of different substances are grouped together under one blanket term, a true education is not provided. Even when people acknowledged that cannabis was less harmful and addictive than harder drugs, they emphasized that it was still incredibly dangerous because it was a gateway drug. As a child, I honestly believed that if I smoked cannabis, it would only be a matter of time until I was shooting up heroin in an alley. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, though, the majority of people who use marijuana do not go on to use other, harder substances. Today, despite all the evidence that cannabis is safe for most people, the lie persists. Cannabis is classified as a Schedule I drug, meaning it has no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Other Schedule I drugs include heroin and meth. In 2018 alone, there were almost 700,000 cannabis arrests, accounting for more than 43% of all drug arrests. And according to the FBI, police made more cannabis arrests than for all violent crimes combined that year. As a country, it's long past time that we focused our attention on true dangers. As a cannabis retailer, it's important to recognize that even though you know cannabis is not dangerous, your customers might not. Big lie number 3. Opioids are safe. Because of the lie that cannabis is dangerous, it was not normalized or legal as a method of pain management. There was a need for pain management, though, and so in 1996, Purdue Pharma, under the direction of the Sackler family, developed and patented OxyContin. It was hailed as a miracle drug that took all the pain away as if by magic. Magic often comes at a cost, though, and in this case, the cost was hundreds of thousands of American lives, more than 500,000 to be specific. In my opinion, Purdue Pharma essentially took a cousin of heroin, put it in a pill, and spent enough money to make the whole world think it was safe. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Sacklers' motive in creating OxyContin had seemingly little, if anything, to do with altruism and everything to do with greed. When OxyContin made its debut, Richard Sackler, then a company executive, said the drug would bring a blizzard of prescriptions that will bury the competition. That's exactly what happened, due to an aggressive marketing campaign driven by the Sackler family, particularly Richard Sackler. The drug went on to generate $35 billion in revenue. Within a few years, evidence emerged that the drug was addictive and led to overdose deaths. While we were all being told that cannabis was the gateway drug, Purdue Pharma was flooding our country with the real gateway drug, opioids. They funded research studies that supported the use of OxyContin, and Richard Sackler put intense pressure on sales managers to sell more. To meet Sackler's demands, sales representatives focused their efforts on high-volume doctors and pushed doctors to prescribe high doses, both of which increased addiction rates. The company even created a rap video to push their sales reps into selling their newest opioid. While Black people were being thrown in prison simply for possession of cannabis, Purdue Pharma was appropriating Black culture and music to legally push a more addictive drug. A Black man never would have gotten away with what the Sacklers did. Only a white family with generational wealth could have pulled this big lie off. This big lie has harmed hundreds of thousands of Americans. As just one example of many, my friend Jeannie's boyfriend, Tommy, was hit by a car, and his doctor prescribed him opioids to manage the pain. Medical cannabis had not yet been legalized in Florida at the time, so cannabis wasn't even presented to him as an option. It was only a matter of time before he became addicted. As we'll discuss further in the next section, this didn't make him less of a person, like many often think of an addict. As overdose deaths increased and the dangers of opioids came to light, doctors began cutting off patients like Tommy. I don't disagree with the decision to rein in the distribution of opioids, but in Tommy's case and many others, because he still had pain and no alternatives, he took to the streets to manage his pain and addiction. The drugs on the street are not lab-tested, nor do they go through the rigorous manufacturing process of pharmaceutical-grade medications. Many street drugs are mixed with dangerous fentanyl and even carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer. One day Tommy was given a bad batch, and he overdosed and transitioned from this world. When a loved one dies, all you want to do is grieve, but there are so many things to do. You have to tell family and friends what happened, reliving the event over and over again. You spend every moment analyzing what brought you to that moment. In the case of an overdose victim, you analyze what you didn't do to save them. Then you have to make phone calls and funeral arrangements. You have to close cell phone accounts and put clothes away. All of this is extremely overwhelming, not to mention dealing with the pure shock of death itself. Looking at Jeannie and Tommy, the hardest factor of it all was that they had a beautiful 3-year-old daughter, Nikki. We all called her Spicy due to her precocious attitude. Understanding the overwhelming burden Jeannie was facing, I offered to take Nikki for a week when Tommy died. Spicy and I will be fine, I told her. During that time, I pretended like nothing had happened, and we spent the week having fun. The night before Nikki went home, we watched Frozen. She was so happy. As I held her in my arms, I couldn't help tearing up, knowing that the next day she was going to find out her daddy was gone, and her little life was going to change forever. All I could do was hold her tighter, wishing things were different than they were. Nikki is 6 now, and she's not as spicy as she was. A couple of weeks ago, she was holding my hand and said to me, "Aunt Char, did you know that my dad's dead?" I squeezed her hand and said, "Yeah, honey, I know." Someday Jeannie will have to explain to Nikki what happened, and Nikki will have to face and come to terms with Tommy's story. Opioids destroy lives, and the ripples extend beyond the addict alone. Nikki is one of hundreds of thousands of children who are going to have to develop an image of their parent who was erased from their life because of opioids. An entire generation of children will be shaped by addiction and the absence of their parents. What do we tell these children? Should we let them believe their mom or dad was bad because they were a drug addict? It is a fundamental disservice to the deceased to not speak the truth to how and why these deaths occur. These deaths are caused by misinformation fed to our public health servants. Today we have more knowledge about opioids and the potential for addiction, and we have terms like the Opioid Crisis and the Opioid Endemic to describe the wide-ranging impact of this big lie. Crisis fails to do the situation justice, though. The scale is magnitudes greater than a crisis. I don't know 1, 2, or 3 people who died from this. I genuinely can't count on 2 hands how many people I know who were lost to opioids. Opioids roared through my rural southwestern Michigan community like a freight train. No one saw it coming. Looking back, we didn't understand at the time why these deaths suddenly started happening. Oxys were everywhere. Then people started getting addicted, then dying. These people have names. Many of them were my peers from high school. I went to their funerals. I hugged their moms, dads, sisters, brothers, children, and friends. I have watched some of their children grow into adults without their mother or father. An entire generation is being robbed of their parents. I have looked into the eyes of survivors and seen the pain. I feel it. Derek Thompson died in the bathroom of an airport on his way to a clean house out of state. Emily Johnson died in her bed after a small moment of weakness after being clean for 5 months. Aunt Sheila lost her boys Joey and Chucky Stevens. The day before Joey died, she begged the doctor to not prescribe him additional pills. Brad woke up next to his girlfriend, who had died in her sleep. Bobby was riding his bike, then sat down and just went to sleep. A single mishap or series of mishaps should not equate to a death sentence, especially when the problem was created by the lie that this medication was safe. Our pharmaceutical model created this illness and has continued to perpetuate the systemic creation of new addicts, resulting in the subsequent increase in deaths related to overdoses. I started seeing these deaths in 2001 when I was 19. 20 years later, the list grows each and every single year. So no, crisis doesn't adequately describe it for me. Epidemic isn't quite right either, as an epidemic implies a disease that is infectious. I think it's best called the opioid endemic. Per the CDC, endemic refers to the constant presence and/or usual prevalence of a disease or infectious agent in a population within a geographic area. That's what we're dealing with. A disease that is not going away and that has very clear borders. Other countries do not suffer from the propensity of opioid-related deaths the way the United States does. In 2018, the European Union estimated 8,317 overdose deaths, or 22.3 deaths per million of the population aged 15 to 64, while the United States had 67,367, or 207 deaths per million. These numbers are total overdose deaths, but the overwhelming percentage are due to opioids. Even taking into account the fact that some EU countries likely underreport, that is a huge discrepancy. If you are listening to this, you very likely live here in the United States. This is our problem, and it is our job to solve it. There is no clear end in sight for the opioid endemic. It was big news for a while, but then it faded into the background. You can only watch so many mothers cry over their children before you become numb. And if you believe the next big lie, you think their son or daughter was fundamentally flawed for being an addict anyway. I know it's difficult to keep caring about a problem when we're constantly bombarded by new issues that need attention too. But as long as people are dying, we have to keep talking about the opioid endemic. I can turn on my radio and hear a PSA about how smoking cigarettes or vaping is going to make my legs fall off. But I've never heard a PSA about opioids triggering a disease called addiction, or about carfentanil hitting the streets and wiping out young people. Can we please change this narrative? You may not be personally connected to the opioid endemic in the way I am, but as a cannabis retailer, you are in the business of pain management. By understanding this big lie and providing people with an alternative to addictive opioids, you could literally save lives. Big lie number 4. Addiction is the addict's fault. I understand the impulse to blame addiction on the addict. An addict's struggles with addiction can be enough to tear their loved ones apart inside. You want to scream, "Why can't you just quit?" But blaming addiction on the addict makes as much sense as blaming someone for having cancer, asthma, or migraines. Here's the thing. No one wants to be an addict. No one. As the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has declared, addiction is not a moral failing or the result of a character flaw. Addiction is a disease of the brain, and per the U.S. National Library of Medicine, opioids have a high potential for causing addiction in some people, even when the medications are prescribed appropriately and taken as directed. Opioids affect people differently. Some people can take opioids and get off of them easily. Others cannot. We don't know exactly why, but some people cannot control their body's attachment to the drug. Not because they are bad people, but because of the composition of their bodies and brains. It's no different from how some people have type 1 diabetes and others don't. For some people, taking an opioid flips a switch in their brain. Continuing to use is not a choice, it's a compulsion that feels as strong as the drive to breathe or eat. Addiction has to start somewhere, though, right? Maybe we can't blame addicts for being addicted, but we can blame them for getting addicted in the first place. It's not that simple. Is it fair to blame my brother Joe for getting addicted when he was only 14 years old, taking a pill his stepdad had given him? Absolutely not. He never had a chance to not get addicted. Many of us were taught, just say no. The idea was that some drug dealer was going to find us in the parking lot and offer us drugs, and all we had to do was say no. I don't know about you, but no stranger or even acquaintance has ever come up and offered me drugs. That's not how it works, especially with opioids. It comes from a trusted source. It comes from your parent, your doctor, your friend. Joe went through the DARE program. If someone had offered him cannabis, he would have said no because he'd been taught that cannabis was bad. But no one prepared him to deal with a trusted adult offering him something dangerous. Every single person I know who got addicted received their first pill or hit from a trusted source. My stepdad and Tommy both got it from their doctors. My brother Joe got it from our stepdad. My hilarious friend Brandy, who has been clean and sober since July 19th, 2015, was given heroin on Christmas by her mom, who first got addicted to opioids prescribed by her doctor before moving on to heroin. This is how the opioid endemic started. It didn't start with irresponsible drug dealers on the street. It started between patients and doctors. Opioids moved through our world via trusted sources. Why do I mention the date of Brandy's sobriety? Brandy was my best friend Jenna's sister and my idol. I knew her before addiction, cried about losing her to it, then celebrated getting her back. I congratulate her for this milestone in her recovery. If someone in recovery tells you how long they have been clean and sober, take the time to congratulate them, because it is a powerful and noteworthy achievement. Addicts are put into the category of scum. They are seen as lowlifes, junkies, criminals, less than human, and unworthy of love. That's how the Sacklers apparently saw them. We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible, Richard Sackler wrote in an email in February 2001. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals. He also said, why should they be entitled to our sympathies? The Sacklers crafted a narrative that fit their self-serving motives in the same way Anslinger did, that they could be so callous and blame the addicts, the victims of their profit-hungry practices, is astounding to me. It's easy to blame the addict, but it's not right. Don't get me wrong, the behavior of an active addict is so difficult to deal with. I have blamed them for their disease. I've been angry. They are very hard to love with all the lies, deceptions, and letdowns. It has taken me my entire life, but after watching, reading, listening, and searching for answers, I finally understand. At the onset of addiction, addicts cannot control their disease. If they could, they would not be addicts. No one chooses that path. Addicts are still accountable for their actions. As I would tell my brother, you're accountable for yourself today. Live one day at a time. Accountability is achieved when they find recovery. It's an addict's job to stay clean, which is a daily fight and struggle. But their addiction is not their fault. Who is responsible for addiction, then? The people who caused the opioid endemic, people like the Sackler family. As Patrick Radden Keefe puts it in Empire of Pain, prior to the introduction of OxyContin, America did not have an opioid crisis. After the introduction of OxyContin, it did. While heroin had been around for years, impacting low-income communities, the introduction of OxyContin significantly exacerbated America's dependence on opioids for pain management. There's no question in my mind that the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma created the opioid endemic. There is even empirical evidence. In 2019, a team of economists released a study looking at the connection between Purdue Pharma's marketing of OxyContin and overdose deaths. When OxyContin was first released, 5 states, California, Idaho, Illinois, New York, and Texas, had triplicate programs, which meant every time doctors wanted to prescribe Schedule II narcotics, they had to fill out special triplicate prescription forms and file one copy with the state, the idea being that state agencies could then maintain a prescription database to monitor for irregularities. As indicated in internal documents available as a result of litigation, Purdue Pharma chose not to market heavily in these states during the initial launch of OxyContin because they believed these states' doctors were less likely to prescribe the drug due to the extra paperwork and not wanting to be monitored by the state. By comparing these 5 states to the rest of the country, we can better understand the impact of OxyContin and, specifically, Purdue's heavy marketing tactics. According to the study, OxyContin distribution was about 50% lower in triplicate states. Prior to 1996, these states actually had higher overdose death rates compared to non-triplicate states. But following the introduction of OxyContin in 1996, the relationship flipped. Non-triplicate states saw substantially slower growth in overdose deaths, and overall, the study's authors estimate that non-triplicate states would have had an average of 36% fewer drug overdose deaths and 44% fewer opioid overdose deaths in 1996 to 2017 if they had been triplicate states. Over the years, Purdue Pharma has come under intense scrutiny for their role in the opioid endemic, and in 2019, facing thousands of lawsuits, the company filed for bankruptcy. In 2021, they agreed to a bankruptcy settlement in which the Sacklers will pay approximately $4.5 billion. While $4.5 billion sounds like a lot of money, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the cost of the opioid endemic, estimated at more than $2 trillion by the states involved in the lawsuit. What's more, from 2008 to 2017, the Sackler family withdrew more than $10 billion from Purdue Pharma, and with an agreement to pay the $4.5 billion over 9 years, meaning they can continue earning a sizable amount of interest off that money. The reality is that the Sacklers will almost certainly remain one of the wealthiest families in America. To date, the Sacklers have not admitted any wrongdoing. As recently as a 2019 deposition, Kathy Sackler said of OxyContin, "It's a very good medicine, and it's a very effective and safe medicine." How insensitive and out of touch with reality is this comment? While the company has twice pleaded guilty to federal crimes, the Sacklers themselves have avoided criminal charges, and the settlement will ensure they continue to do so, as it includes sweeping immunity from future opioid lawsuits. So if you want to blame someone for addiction, blame the Sacklers, blame Big Pharma, blame the people who knew this drug was addictive but lied to us, told us it was safe, and pumped it into our communities. Cannabis and opioids are very different drugs. As we'll explore in the next chapter, cannabis is far safer than many people realize. Due to the nature of cannabis, I do not believe cannabis retailers will be creating addicts the way Purdue Pharma did. But it's still important to understand this big lie, because some of your customers may have struggled with addiction and need compassion from you. The consequences of these lies. These big lies are all connected. Without racism, cannabis wouldn't have been stigmatized. Without the stigma against cannabis, we would have had a non-addictive alternative to opioids. Without the lies that opioids are safe and that addicts are to blame for addiction, Nikki would still have her father, and hundreds of thousands more people would still be alive today. Racism caused the opioid endemic. Fears of Black people combined with lies told to us by entitled white people who perpetrated the largest crime of this century created this version of addiction. If you have lost a loved one to the opioid endemic, racism killed him or her. Among many other very human reasons, this is why racism is an issue of public health. If you're someone who thinks racism doesn't exist, I want you to really sit with this chapter for a while. Not only does racism exist, but it has been actively used as a tool against all of us. All of us who have lost loved ones to the opioid endemic, all of us who have suffered because of the criminalization and stigma against cannabis. Our enemy is not and never has been Black people. It's those who lie to us, who take fear and turn it against us. It's the racist white guy who perpetuated lies about Black people and cannabis to keep his job and further his personal agenda. It's the wealthy pharmaceutical family that lied to us about opioids and addiction so that they could get even richer. I wish I could say these lies are in the past, but they remain alive and well today. When he was a U.S. attorney in Alabama in the 1980s, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions said he thought the KKK were okay until I found out they smoked pot. In April 2016, he said, "Good people don't smoke marijuana." In 2021, Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts said, "If you legalize marijuana, you're going to kill your kids." As long as these lies exist, people are going to remain uneducated and misinformed, leading to a stigma against cannabis, and that stigma has consequences. In many instances, even in states with recreational legalization, cannabis users are still fundamentally risking their jobs and livelihoods due to the classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug. That law controls any company that is federally regulated, like banks and insurance companies. I'm sure you've faced your own headaches trying to gain access to banking. And insurance companies hold cannabis usage against workers, charging higher rates to those companies who don't ensure drug-free work environments. This means that many jobs still drug test, which can prevent a cannabis user from being hired, get them fired, or interfere with their workers' compensation. Do I think people should be high on the job? No. However, there are plenty of mechanisms to ingest cannabis that do not produce psychoactive effects, and I believe workers should be allowed to use cannabis however they like in their personal time. Similar rules should apply to cannabis as apply to alcohol. I know someone who works as a supervisor for a railroad company in Mississippi. He was involved in a freak accident that resulted in his hand being mangled. He has never smoked while on the job, but he does use cannabis on his personal time, which is not surprising to me considering the physical toll of this kind of work. Per workers' comp rules on a drug-free workplace, he was drug tested, and they found cannabis in his system. It doesn't matter that he did it off the clock. His workers' compensation is now attempting to refuse to pay for his injury. Meanwhile, because it's Mississippi and there's no legal access to cannabis, his doctors tried to give him opioids to manage his pain. You can't use cannabis because the government says it's addictive and has no medical use, so instead you're offered a drug that has addicted millions of people. What an ironic, vicious circle of damage. Any state that has not normalized cannabis as an alternative method of pain management is actively creating addicts today. They may not be doing it on purpose, but if the only pain medication available is opioids, addiction will be the unintended consequence. The most effective way to recover from the opioid endemic is to not get people addicted in the first place. This perpetuates the endemic and prolongs our collective recovery. The stigma against cannabis has consequences for us as retailers, too. Many of your customers might enter your store feeling scared or ashamed, believing falsehoods. Your community might not appreciate your presence. On a personal level, you might feel uncomfortable speaking about your job in certain situations, like around other parents or at non-industry specific professional events. As professionals in this industry, it's our responsibility and in our best interest to replace these big lies with big truths. The criminalization of cannabis is a form of institutional racism, with Black people and minorities being disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. For many people, cannabis is safe and is a legitimate alternative for pain management, as well as treatment for dozens of other medical conditions. Opioids are extremely addictive for some individuals, making alternatives to pain management not just important, but necessary to improve the collective health of our nation. Addiction is a disease that is not a moral failing of any one individual, and those individuals should not be treated as lepers. The best solution is to implement policies that do not create new addicts. That includes removing cannabis drug testing policies and providing true legal access to clean, lab-tested cannabis. When it comes to breaking the stigma, you are on the front lines. In knowing the truth about where the stigma came from and why it's so harmful, you can begin to change it. One customer at a time, you can begin to undo the big lies and share the reality